Lakhdar Brahimi resigns as the UN Arab League envoy to Syria following a 2-year effort to bring peace to the war-ravaged country. The Iraqi army launches a massive operation near Baghdad while a series of car bombs rocked the capital, killing over 25 people. The Saudi Arabian foreign minister invites his Iranian counterpart to Riyadh, saying that the monarchy is ready to talk. And an Israeli court sentences former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert to 6 years in prison for accepting bribes. Hello and welcome. You're watching Al Ittijah World News with me, Sergeant Preradovic. We begin with our top story tonight, and the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has announced that the joint UN Arab League Special Envoy to Syria, Lakhdar Brahimi, is resigning. The announcement was made during a joint press conference between the two high-level officials. Standing beside Brahimi at the UN headquarters in New York, Ban said that the UN mediator will be stepping down from his post on May 31st.
This occasion, which is not very pleasant for me, it's very sad that I leave this position and leave Syria behind in such a bad state. But as you said, the Secretary General, I have absolutely no doubt that you will continue as you have to do everything that is humanly possible to work with the Security Council, with the neighbors of Syria, and indeed with the Syrian parties themselves to end this crisis. I'm sure that the crisis will end. The question is only, and this everybody who has a responsibility and an influence in the situation have to remember that the question is how many more dead, how much more destruction there is going to be before Syria becomes again the Syria we have known, the new Syria that will be different from the Syria of the past, but it will be the Syria we have loved and admired for many, many years. I'm extremely grateful to you, Secretary General, and especially that I know you are traveling in a few minutes, that you have taken time to come down for this occasion personally. Thank you very much indeed, Secretary.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your great. Thank you very much. Thank you for your.
After unsuccessfully trying to mediate an end to the bloody conflict in Syria, UN Arab League Special Envoy Lakhdar Brahimi, who has spent his career in the diplomatic trenches of the world's most intractable conflicts, gave up on Tuesday. The 80-year-old Algerian had recently succeeded in swaying the Syrian warring sides to 2 rounds of peace talks in Geneva this year, but emerged with no solution to the violence that has killed more than 130,000 people and displaced millions since 2011.
I'm very, very sorry, and I apologize to the Syrian people that their hopes, which were very, very high that something will happen here, I think that the little that has been achieved in Homs gave them even more hope that maybe this is the beginning of the coming out of this horrible crisis they are in. I apologize to them that on these 2 rounds we haven't helped them very much.
The UN mediator has made no secret of the fact that he is frustrated with his inability to facilitate a political solution to the crisis, with many Western states carrying on with their arming of militants operating in the war-torn country.
It is a very, very, very complicated subject. Failure is always staring at us in the face. As far as the United Nations is concerned, we will certainly not leave one stone unturned if there is a possibility to move forward.
However, he is not the first to resign in frustration. Former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan stepped down from the same post in 2012. And like Brahimi, he complained that the permanent members of the UN Security Council could not unite behind his calls for an end to the violence. Brahimi was known for bringing patience, pragmatism and a healthy dose of humour to the many impossible missions he embarked on, and Syria was no different. He had reportedly told the Syrian delegates in Geneva to hurry up, since they'll be done in 20 years at their rate, but that he won't be around by then. He was also known for his limitless patience and hard work towards the final goal, despite the rocky road ahead. In the case of Syria, however, that road seemed to hit a dead end, with opposition militants plagued by infighting and the international community as divided as ever.
Well, Mimi Laham is a Syrian political activist, and she joins us now via Skype to discuss this further. Mimi, were you surprised by this announcement?
No, I believe Brahimi was hinting about his resignation quite early, a few months ago at least, and certainly since the end of Geneva too. Clearly, after the breakdown of the talks, he would have felt that he had failed to achieve peace in Syria, and so we can see, just as the previous UN envoy Kofi Annan quit, it seems to be a trend.
Maybe what do you make of these reports that are emerging, diplomatic sources claiming that Brahimi has in fact resigned because of the Damascus government's decision to move forward with general elections on June 3rd?
I think that obviously the main reason that he's resigning is because he's failed to do his job, which is peace in Syria. The election is just a nice way to pin the blame on somebody else, to pin the blame on the Syrian government for the breakdown of talks. In reality, it was the opposition who Brahimi failed to convince to have realistic goals in terms of what they can get out of Syria. They claim they want a democracy, but they want to disenfranchise the parts of Syrian society that would want to vote for Assad. They would prefer, instead of democracy, to have regime change, and Brahimi failed to convince them otherwise. Furthermore, Geneva, the opposition had no influence over the insurgency on the ground, and that made negotiating with them virtually impossible.
And where does Brahimi's departure leave peace efforts in Syria, Mimi?
Well, I think one other thing about Brahimi is that he sort of lost credibility in the eyes of Syria, as he showed a clear bias towards the opposition. And so replacing him would actually sort of reset credibility for the US. I think the Geneva talks were more of a platform between Russia and the US for negotiations, rather than for Syrians to negotiate. Unfortunately, it seems that the US doesn't actually want peace in Syria. They want to destroy Syria as much as possible and bleed them down. And they're using the negotiations to try to extend the lifespan of the insurgency through small deals here and there that they hoped to have saved home for them to maintain their control there. But when it worked out that way, it seems that peace can only be achieved in Syria. It seems, unfortunately, that it can only be achieved militarily and not through political dialogue.
Okay, Mimi, I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it there. We do apologize to our viewers for the poor quality of the line there. Syrian political activist Mimi Laham, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Meanwhile, on the ground in Syria, at least 4 people have been killed and scores injured following a car bombing that targeted a public park in the suburbs of the capital, Damascus. The Syrian state news agency reported that the explosive-laden vehicle was parked near a compound of schools in the busy district of Arin, with more than 100 kilograms of explosives planted in the seemingly harmless pickup truck. Well, French police have arrested 6 men suspected of traveling to fight along militants in Syria. The operation in Strasbourg came weeks after authorities announced a new push to prevent French militants from traveling to Syria. In a brief statement, France's interior minister said the sweep showed the total determination of the government to fight terrorism and the enlisting of youths in violent radicalization. 7 weeks after UN aid trucks crossed from Turkey into Syria for the first time, aid workers and officials in southern Turkey still have no idea exactly where the supplies ended up. Aid workers in the Gaziantep area near the Turkish border say no distribution lists have been made available for the convoy of 78 trucks taking food and medicine to Syria's mainly Kurdish Hassak province. Moving on to some other news now, and Saudi Arabia's Foreign Minister Saud al-Faisal extended an invitation to his Iranian counterpart Mohammad Jawad Zarif to visit the kingdom. This as U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel landed in Riyadh for the first leg of his regional tour, focusing on Iran's nuclear program and the Syrian crisis.
Saudi Arabia's Foreign Minister Saud al-Faisal has told a news conference in Riyadh that his Iranian counterpart Mohammad Javad Zarif has been officially invited to the kingdom, but has yet to respond to the invitation.
Well, there has been an expression of a desire to renew the communication between our two countries, expressed by Iranian officials, by the President and by the Foreign Minister. But, and we sent him an invitation, the Foreign Minister, to visit Saudi Arabia. But this intention to visit has not become a fact.
The differences between Tehran and Riyadh are countless and range from regional issues such as Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon to thorny internal problems. Syria tops a list of disputes with Saudi Arabia, endorsing the armed opposition fighting against the Syrian government, while Iran has repeatedly pledged its support to Damascus. Zarif has toured the Persian Gulf numerous times since his appointment as the Islamic Republic's top diplomat, and particularly following the interim deal reached last November with the P5+1 over its nuclear program. The Gulf Cooperation Council member perceives Iran as a lurking threat, particularly in light of the ongoing nuclear negotiations between Iran and the West. To quench Saudi fears, U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel arrived in Riyadh for talks with officials. Hagel's visit comes as part of a regional tour that will focus on Iran's nuclear program and the Syrian conflict. Last year, Zarif expressed his willingness to visit Riyadh and called on the Persian Gulf Kingdom to cooperate with Tehran to achieve regional stability. If Zarif does respond positively to the invitation, many believe it would mark the beginning of an easing of tensions in the Persian Gulf. As Saudi-Iranian relations are without a doubt an incarnation of the regional power balance, some regional experts assert that the current icy ties between Tehran and Riyadh may very well improve.
Meanwhile, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, said that the United States and other world powers will never be capable of crippling the Iranian nation through pressure. Sayyid Khamenei's statement comes as the P5+1 group of countries and Iranian officials are meeting once again in the Austrian capital Vienna in a bid to hammer out a final agreement over Tehran's nuclear energy program.
The US cannot do anything, just as they have not been able to do anything to this day. Other powers cannot do anything either. They cannot do anything, not only in the term of any military action, but in the general sense of the word. They cannot cripple the Iranian nation. They cannot exert pressure on the Iranian nation to bring it to its knees.
The fourth round of talks in the Austrian capital between the P5+1 group and Iran has kicked off and is set to last through to May 16th. Officials from the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, along with an Iranian delegation, have until July 20th to draft a permanent accord over Tehran's nuclear energy program.
Good morning, no comment.
Negotiators will be pushing to transform an interim deal struck in Geneva in November of last year into a comprehensive agreement. Under the Geneva deal, the P5+1 has agreed to provide Iran with some sanctions relief in exchange for the Islamic Republic limiting certain aspects of its nuclear activities during a 6-month period. The intermediate deal compelled Iran to suspend 20% uranium enrichment within 6 months and to keep the uranium enrichment levels at 5%. In addition, Iran pledged to dispose of all uranium enriched to 20%, to suspend the construction of the Arak heavy water reactor, not to deploy new uranium enrichment centrifuges, and to broaden the access of IAEA inspectors to its nuclear facilities. Negotiations will officially begin on Wednesday, but Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif and EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton are set to hold a working dinner Tuesday evening. For his part, Zarif has vowed to strongly defend Iran's nuclear rights during the talks.
It will be basically exchange of ideas, not negotiations at this stage. We are engaged in a process of seeking the views of each other and looking at how we can reach an agreement, and we will hopefully start drafting something in the future rounds.
Analysts assert that the talks between world powers and Tehran have entered their most sensitive stage. For their part, the negotiators remain optimistic over fully resolving the decade-old dispute between the West and Iran over the latter's nuclear energy program.
Let's get some analysis on this now with Dr. Mohammad Marandi. He is a professor at the Tehran University. Dr. Marandi, always good to have you with us. Let's begin with this invitation from the Saudis to Iran's foreign minister there. Why now?
Well, it's difficult to say, but obviously the Saudis are facing many difficulties. They have surrounded themselves with enemies. In the past, they used to antagonize Iran in this region, but now they have antagonized the people of Bahrain because they occupied the country. They've antagonized Qatar because of their differences. They have serious problems with Oman. With Yemen, they have problems with political organizations and different communities like the Houthis, as well as other Salafists in the south, as well as other groups. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and across the Arab world. Iraq, of course, the Iraqi government and Saudi Arabia are on very poor terms, and there's Syria as well. So Saudi Arabia has isolated itself and surrounded itself with many enemies. And I think that the fact that the king of the country is very old and fragile, the country feels very insecure. And perhaps they feel that this is an opportunity to ease tensions for the sake of the stability of their own country.
You mentioned Syria there, Doctor. So, given the fact that militants, which are backed by the Saudis, are retreating across the country, are they making this invitation essentially out of a position of weakness?
Well, that is quite possible. The very fact that they are giving out an invitation at this stage does show that they are in a position of weakness, because for over 3 years the Iranians have been trying to talk reason to the Saudi regime, and the Saudis have ignored Iran calls to ease regional tensions. But now, as the situation in Iraq is stabilizing, relatively speaking, of course, it's still a very difficult and sad situation, including today, but still the government is stronger than it was, and the elections went well. In Syria, the government has been making many achievements over the past year. I was in Syria just a couple of weeks ago for a week. We went to different cities such as Homs, and you can see how things have changed since the last time I went. It was much better just a few months before. So the situation in Syria is much different than before, and the Saudis feel much less confident about themselves. So I think it's valid to say that to interpret this invitation as being given from a position of weakness is quite true.
So the bottom line then, Doctor, do you think that this is the beginning of a process which could facilitate greater regional stability sometime in the near future?
Many here hope that this will be the case. The Saudis have, along with the Qataris and their Western allies, have created great suffering in this region. The Iraqi Prime Minister has blamed a lot of the problems of the country on the Saudi support for takfiris and extremists. And the Syrian government and the Syrian people, because too, they blame the Saudi regime. A poll was carried recently by a Turkish institute, a think tank, and 88% of Syrians blamed or thought that Turkey was not a good neighbor because of its activities in Syria, and that of course would also reflect on Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis have been a major source of instability and hardship through the export of terrorism and extremism, and even Western countries which have been traditional allies of the Saudi regime are deeply concerned. In Nigeria, even the more recent attacks, people are blaming it on the ideology being exported from Saudi Arabia. North Africa also too is facing extremist organizations carrying out attacks on both soldiers, government employees, but also civilians in countries like Libya and Egypt. So Saudi Arabia is losing friends very fast, and of course it's facing increased tensions at home. The Daesh seems, according to reports that we've heard from Saudi Arabia, a large number of people affiliated to Daesh were arrested in Saudi Arabia recently. So the Saudis, I think, are now beginning to feel the blowback from their extremist policies, and that is deeply concerning for the Saudi regime. So hopefully this is an opportunity for the Saudis to rethink their foreign policy.
Okay, Doctor, and before we wrap up, I just want to get your thoughts on those ongoing negotiations in Vienna between the P5+1 and Iran. Of course, can we expect any significant progress there?
Well, it's difficult to say at this stage. The Iranians have said, and President Rouhani has just a couple of days ago made a very strong statement saying that Iran will not accept an apartheid system with regards to nuclear energy, and it will not relinquish any of its rights. The only way, therefore, for a solution to be achieved or to be brought about is for the United States and its Western allies within the framework of the P5+1 to respect Iran's rights, and in return Iran will be as open as necessary to relieve any concerns that may exist about Iran's nuclear program. But many believe that the will does not exist at the moment in the United States. The language coming out of Washington is still harsh, but at the same time, since the United States is increasingly isolating itself through multiple crises with the Russians in Ukraine, in Syria, across the board in the region, with Iran, with China, the United States simply cannot move towards escalating its problems with Iran. So the belief is that what will probably happen is that we'll have another extension for 6 months, but of course at this stage nothing is for certain.
Professor at Tehran University, Dr. Mohammad Marandi, thank you very much for joining us tonight, sir. Well, leaked documents from the U.S. National Security Agency have revealed that Susan Rice, who served as the U.S. ambassador to the UN in 2010, thanked the agency for spying on the UN Security Council members, which helped Washington impose sanctions against Iran. Susan Rice, who is now serving as the U.S. National Security Advisor, asked the NSA back in 2010 to spy on Security Council members so that she could develop a strategy concerning a vote on sanctions against Iran's nuclear energy program. The revelations were made in a book written by an American journalist. You're watching AEE World News, still to come on the program. Search efforts for the abducted Nigerian schoolgirls are stepped up. We'll have more on that after we come back. Welcome back. You're with AEE, and these are the top stories that we're following for you this hour. Dr. Brahimi resigns as the joint UN Arab League envoy to Syria following a 2-year effort to bring peace to the war-ravaged country. The Iraqi army launches a massive operation near Baghdad while a series of car bombs rocked the capital, killing over 25 people. Saudi Arabian foreign minister invites his Iranian counterpart to Riyadh, saying that the monarchy is ready to talk. And an Israeli court sentences former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert to 6 years in prison for accepting bribes. The Iraqi army has begun a full-scale military operation in the city of Dawlabiyah near the capital Baghdad to root out militants belonging to the Al-Qaeda-linked Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant.
The deafening sound of artillery shells are once again being heard raining across the city of Fallujah, nearly 2 weeks after the end of the country's parliamentary elections. The Iraqi army has continued with its military operation in and around Fallujah to clear the region from Al-Qaeda-linked Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant militants. According to the Interior Ministry, Iraqi troops have made some advances directly into the center of the city. The statement released also included that armed forces have inflicted great losses upon the militants, confiscating their equipment after leaving scores dead. Meanwhile, west of the capital, Baghdad, the army has also launched an offensive in the city of Duwaylabiyah in the Abu Ghraib region. The series of military offensives launched by government forces is part of the much-delayed military operation to retake the embattled city from militants in the rest of Anbar province. Soldiers numbering more than 4,000 have been deployed along with police officers and pro-government tribal groups to Fallujah, some 48 kilometers east of Baghdad. The Anbar province has been plagued by violence since December, when the army removed an anti-government protest camp in the provincial capital of Ramadi. Authorities said the camp was being used as headquarters for the leadership of Al-Qaeda. The bloodshed later spread to the nearby city of Fallujah. Violence in Ramadi has largely been subdued, while Fallujah remains completely out of government control after being overrun in January by militants from the ISIL. The army barricaded the city in response and has since been delaying the assault to avoid civilian casualties. Now, the full-scale military operation is underway in a bid to quell Al-Qaeda-linked fighters and hostile tribesmen, whose resurgence has killed hundreds of civilians, forced nearly 400,000 people to flee their homes, and inflicted severe damage on infrastructure.
Meanwhile, a spate of deadly bomb blasts, mostly targeting Shia majority areas in the Iraqi capital Baghdad, killed at least 25 people, wounding dozens of others in the first major series of attacks to strike the capital since the country held parliamentary elections last month.
The Iraqi capital Baghdad woke up today to a fresh bout of deadly violence targeting Shia districts. The blasts, which killed at least 25 people and also wounded more than 80 others, came as officials tallied votes from the April 30th parliamentary polls, amid a protracted surge in bloodshed that has killed more than 3,300 people this year alone. At least 9 car bombs were detonated almost simultaneously during morning rush hour. 2 of the blasts exploded near a traffic police headquarters in the eastern Baladiyyat neighborhood, and explosions also struck Sadr City, or Jamila, Ma'amel, and the central commercial district of Karada. Another vehicle wrecked with explosives was detonated in the mostly Sunni area of Arab Jabur, killing 3 people, while a roadside bomb also went off near a police patrol in the west of Baghdad, killing 1. Smoke could be seen billowing above several areas of the capital. Pedestrians reported several shop fronts badly damaged and nearby cars reduced to mangled wrecks of metal. Elsewhere, a young boy was killed in a rocket attack just north of the capital. No group immediately claimed responsibility for the apparently coordinated attacks, but militant groups have in the past set off coordinated bombings in the capital and often target the country's Shia majority. Iraq is suffering its worst violence since a sectarian conflict killed tens of thousands of people in 2006 and 2007. Security officials have expressed concern that militants, mainly the notorious jihadist group of the Islamic State of Iraq in the Levant, could seek to exploit the vote count and what is expected to be a long period of haggling to form a government to set off attacks that could worsen an already fragile Iraq.
Well, the president of Iraq's Kurdistan regional government, Masoud Barzani, called Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's rule authoritarian while threatening to end the KRG's participation in the federal government. Barzani stated Kurdish parties would meet as soon as the results of the April 30th parliamentary elections were officially announced to decide how to proceed. The Kurds have been a partner in the national government since the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. A Tel Aviv court has sentenced former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert to 6 years in prison on charges of bribery in what is believed to be one of the Israeli entity's worst corruption scandals.
Former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert has been sentenced to 6 years in prison, not for committing crimes against humanity, but over a bribery case that has put his name on the Israeli entity's political wall of shame. A court in Tel Aviv handed down a 6-year prison term to Olmert and slammed him with a fine of the equivalent of $290,000 after having convicted him in March on 2 charges of bribery. The court today has spoken. Its words should be read and internalized. Whoever receives bribes and whoever gives bribes is corrupt, and whoever is corrupt, their fate is set to be jailed for a long time. In his defense, Olmert pleaded not guilty.
He did not take bribes, he did not receive a bribe, and he still sees himself, according to his feelings, as innocent, and will go with us to the Supreme Court to appeal.
Public opinion, however, begged to differ.
If the corruption went all the way up to the Prime Minister, and that's only what we know, imagine what we don't know.
It's about time that the politicians would know that if they'll be corrupted, so they'll have paid the price for it.
What is believed to be one of the worst corruption scandals in the Israeli entity, which involved the Holy Land complex in Al-Quds, also known as Jerusalem, has dragged on for 2 years. The lawyer turned defendant was installed as prime minister in 2006 to replace his predecessor Ariel Sharon, who had slipped into a coma. He resigned later in 2008. Olmert's guilt and reputation alike have been marred by the 2006 war against Lebanon, which killed more than 1,200 Lebanese, most of whom were civilians, and which marked an embarrassing defeat for Israeli occupation forces in the face of the Lebanese resistance group Hezbollah. For many, if Olmert were to be convicted of crimes against humanity, a life sentence would not have sufficed for justice to be served.
They try to pretend that they are highly civilized and they go with modern, sophisticated regimes on the accountability of everyone, including the prime minister, and no one is above the law. All these words which are repeated many times. But if we go a little bit in the details, we'll discover bigger crime, as you mentioned. The first, that they avoid to put anyone in criminal court on their killing of the others and the civilians and destruction of houses in the Palestinian area and in Lebanon, mainly when Ehud Olmert was prime minister. So this process is trying to innocent Israel, on one hand, to say this is the activity of the government to protect, between brackets, their civilians, so by attacking the others, and no one is making the account of the crimes. On the other hand, to say that even if he is responsible, but Israel is making an account on the bribery, the fraud, the falsification of papers and the accounts and so on. Well, this is a minor thing coming from the ideology itself of the Zionist. When the Zionist state is built on confiscating the land of the others, confiscating the nation of the Palestinians and transform it into Israel, and then pretend that they are not accountable. So everyone will try to take something as a compensation or a bribe or something like this for his own, saying that this is the money of the others. It's not the money of the state. But unfortunately for this ex-prime minister Ehud Olmert, that he is accused with many processes. The wondering thing that the system in itself is very corrupted. Mr. Olmert was accused of falsification and fraud since 2002. It's not the first time. Even before this, in 1998, there was an accusation before that, and it was camouflaged in order to bring him with the majority of the power that time and to be a minister for industry and work. So I think the system itself is encouraging everyone to do the robbery on the name of the legality of Israel, and the legality, as far as they are not giving anything of the rights of the Palestinians, it will be going on corrupted.
A Palestinian lawyer, Shireen al-Issawi, has begun an open-ended hunger strike to protest against her detention by Israeli occupation forces. Al-Issawi started her hunger strike 4 days ago to demonstrate against her as well as her brother's Mekdad's continued incarceration at a time when all other lawyers involved in the same case were released. Al-Issawi comes from a family well known for its resistance against Israeli occupation in the holy city of Al-Quds and is the sister of Samer al-Issawi, a renowned former Palestinian detainee and hunger striker. The U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry will meet Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in London this week for the first time since the so-called Mideast peace talks collapsed last month.
The U.S. State Department announced on Monday that U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry will meet with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in London this week. The meeting will be the first since the so-called Mideast peace talks collapsed last month.
You all enjoyed the beautiful.
According to State Department spokeswoman Jan Psaki, the purpose of the meeting is to discuss bilateral relations with the Palestinian Authority. However, Psaki did not rule out any discussions over the U.S.-brokered Palestinian-Israeli peace process. Meanwhile, a Palestinian official stated earlier that the meeting will touch on a possible resumption of negotiations with the Israelis. The peace talks were relaunched by Kerry as he dragged the Israelis and Palestinians back to the negotiating table in July of last year, ending a 3-year freeze in negotiations. Yet before the April 29th deadline, Kerry's apparent peace efforts were derailed after the Israelis reneged on commitments made during the 9 months of fruitless talks. The Israeli entity announced plans for 700 new settlements on occupied Palestinian lands before refusing to release Palestinian detainees. As a result, the Palestinian Authority moved ahead with its plans to join 15 UN conventions, a move that the Israelis consider to be a violation of the terms of the negotiations. Earlier this month, Fatah also unveiled plans to set up a unity government with various Palestinian factions, including the Hamas resistance group, ending years of divisions. Thursday's meeting in London is seen by some analysts as a last-ditch attempt by Kerry to revive negotiations and slow down a unilateral push on the part of the Palestinians to declare a state of their own.
Yemen's security forces killed 8 suspected al-Qaeda militants during a raid targeting the country's southern region. Yemen's Air Force reportedly attacked a convoy carrying weapons and ammunition on the road linking the Shabwa and Marib provinces. The attack is part of Yemen's latest crackdown against al-Qaeda militants in the Arabian Peninsula. At least 5 miners were killed after an explosion at a coal mine in western Turkey. Although rescue workers have managed to pull out around 30 people, hundreds remain trapped underground. The explosion, which took place in Turkey's Mansia province, was believed to be triggered by a faulty electrical transformer. 7 Ukrainian soldiers were killed after clashes erupted between pro-Russian activists and forces loyal to Kiev near the eastern Ukrainian city of Slavyansk. Elsewhere, separatists in Luhansk said that their governor survived an assassination attempt after unknown assailants opened fire on his car with automatic rifles. Meanwhile, Russia has accused pro-Western interim leaders of refusing to negotiate with pro-Russian activists, adding that regional rights of those in the eastern regions must be discussed before Ukraine holds the May 25th presidential poll.
Russia is taking its time before reacting to Donetsk's People's Republic's plea to consider its accession into Russia, while calling for dialogue between Kiev and the eastern regions. The Kremlin's press office issued a statement saying that Moscow respects the will of the people in Donetsk and Lugansk and hopes that the practical realization of the outcome of the referendums will be carried out in a civilized manner. On Monday, Donetsk People's Republic proclaimed itself a sovereign state and asked Moscow to consider its plea to join Russia. Earlier in the day, the results of referendums were announced in Donetsk and Lugansk regions, showing the majority of voters support self-rule, amid an intensified military operation by Kiev which resulted in many deaths. This comes as German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier said on Tuesday that the May 25th presidential vote will be crucial in bringing the country out of the crisis, after arriving in Kiev for a key visit.
We all agree that the presidential election on May 25th will play a crucial role. The situation, especially in eastern Ukraine, remains very threatening. Nations in Europe support your plan of holding a national dialogue under Ukrainian leadership.
In response, Russia accused pro-Western interim leaders in Kiev of refusing to negotiate with pro-Russian activists, asserting that regional rights must be discussed before Ukraine holds presidential polls. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Grigory Kharysyan told the European Union's Moscow representative that Kiev's refusal to engage in real dialogue was a serious impediment to the escalation of the crisis, adding that the negotiations must be held in the near future, and in any case before the May 25th elections.
Well, international efforts to locate and free hundreds of Nigerian schoolgirls are in full swing. Washington has announced the deployment of surveillance drones over Nigeria while local authorities ponder their options.
In the hope of locating a group of abducted schoolgirls, in what has so far been an ambiguous search effort, aerial operations are underway, with American manned aircraft floating over Nigeria. The U.S. administration has revealed that intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance assets will join the international search, while commercial satellite imagery has already been shared with the Nigerian government.
Our intelligence experts are combing through every detail of the video for clues that might help in ongoing efforts to secure the release of the girls.
Even though this tape shows that most of the teenagers were at the same place, the timing and location of it still represents a mystery. Some Nigerian sources noted that the landscape in the video resembles the Sambisa forest, an area close to the town from where the girls were seized. But just as the investigation were expanded, Nigerian authorities were embroiled in an argument about the next move. Nigerian security services said all options for the girls' release were on the table, including a swap deal offered by the militia.
If it is necessary that we use whatever kind of action to get our girls out of the captivity that they are in now, we will do it.
This concession, however, was quickly dismissed by the Interior Ministry, which said that no exchange would be coordinated with the terrorist group, even if that was the only way to free all those schoolgirls.
Well, mediators who brokered South Sudan's fragile ceasefire deal have called on warring sides to abide by that accord. Fighting broke out soon after dawn on Sunday, a day after the ceasefire was signed by President Salva Kiir and rebel chief Riek Machar in the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa. This marks the second time in the 5-month conflict that a truce has failed to hold. Well, the results of the first round of Afghanistan's presidential elections are due to be announced tomorrow, with the outcome expected to trigger a tense runoff between frontrunner Abdullah Abdullah and former World Bank economist Ashraf Ghani.
Afghanistan is due to announce the results of its first-round presidential elections on Wednesday, with former Foreign Minister Abdullah Abdullah and ex-World Bank economist Ashraf Ghani set to go ahead in a runoff vote. Results from the April 5th election were released late last month, but the final declaration will include the outcome of weeks of deliberation over fraud complaints. The preliminary results showed 53-year-old Abdullah Abdullah securing 44.9% of the first-round vote, with 64-year-old Ashraf Ghani garnering 31.5% of the ballots. However, as none of the 8 candidates appear to have gained more than 50%, a runoff between the two leading names is required as Afghanistan undergoes its first democratic transfer of power. The Independent Election Commission said a runoff date will be announced on Wednesday, but as for the showdown date that will decide President Hamid Karzai's successor, has been penciled in on June 14th, according to Afghan officials. On Monday, frontrunner Abdullah received a major boost with the endorsement of third-place Zalmay Rasul, a close ally of Karzai. Another costly and potentially violent election could be avoided by deal-making in the coming weeks, and Rasul's support for Abdullah will likely increase pressure on Ghani to concede. However, as the Karzai era comes to an end, Afghanis are hoping that the country will be able to stand on its own again and rebuild the crisis-ridden nation after years of foreign occupation.
And now time for a recap of our top headlines. Lakhdar Brahimi resigns as the joint UN Arab League envoy to Syria following a 2-year effort to bring peace to the war-ravaged country. The Iraqi army launches a massive operation against militant positions near Baghdad, while a series of car bombs rocked the capital, killing over 25 people. Saudi Arabian foreign minister invites his Iranian counterpart to Riyadh, saying that the monarchy is ready to talk. And an Israeli court sentences former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert to 6 years in prison for accepting bribes. That's all the time we have for you tonight from me and the AEE TV news team. Thank you for watching.